Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm Jack Hagel. The candidates running to be North Carolina's next Attorney General have a few things in common. They both went to law school at UNC, they served in the state legislature, and they gained national profile while representing Charlotte area districts in Congress. But that's pretty much where the similarities end between Republican Dan Bishop and Democrat Jeff Jackson. Each offers a different vision for the state's highest law enforcement post. WRAL reporter Brian Murphy has been covering the race, and he joins us now to break it down. Brian, good to see you again.
Yep, thanks for having me.
We seem to have two polar opposites who also have a lot in common. Who are the candidates, and what are their similarities, maybe some of their differences?
Yeah, well, Dan Bishop, the Republican, is 60 years old. He was a longtime litigator, commercial litigator, a lawyer. Before he got involved in politics, he's probably best known as the author of HB 2, the so-called bathroom bill that many believe cost Pat McCrory the election. And we can probably put a pin in that and get back to it, but I think HB 2 is really interesting. It would have stopped people from using the restroom unless it identified with the gender on their birth certificate. When you look back now, 8 years later, that looks somewhat quaint. Laws all over the country have gone much, much further in dealing with transgender rights without the political and economic backlash that came to North Carolina. So I think that's kind of an interesting position. Jeff Jackson, much younger, 42, is served in the military in Afghanistan, is still in the Army National Guard, sort of rose to prominence, via social media, has used TikTok to kind of explain what's happening in Congress, pulled sort of a stunt when he was in the State House. Nobody else showed up one day, and he was there all by himself at the state legislature and did a YouTube video, was live, passing bills, quote unquote passing bills, all by himself during a snowstorm. So I think, these two, while they have similar backgrounds, neither one's been elected statewide, and now they're running in a pretty high profile statewide election. So there's a lot of differences between them. I think Jackson has tried to portray himself as more bipartisan, and Bishop as kind of more extremist in the sense that he's beholden to kind of the conservative movement. Bishop is a member of the Freedom Caucus, the very conservative part of the Republican Party up in Congress, and has backed Mark Robinson, which is something that's come up in ads. And you've probably seen a ton of ads. The other thing they have in common, they both have a lot of money in this race. Jackson has more personally, or he's raised more his campaign, but both sides are getting a lot of outside spending in this race.
These guys also have big policy difference, obviously being from different political parties. What are they campaigning on?
Yeah, Dan Bishop is really talking about crime and safety. He's made, if you've seen any of his television ads, making a big deal about the increase in crime rates in North Carolina over a 10-year period. Over the last 2 years or so, those rates have dipped slightly, but if you look at them from 2014, they are much higher in violent crimes. Property crimes, surprisingly, are way down. I'm not sure what leads to that, but so he has made. If you look at his very first ad, do you and your family feel safer than they felt, just a few years ago? He talked to me about, if you want your children and your grandchildren to be safe, then you've got to elect me. I'll restore law and order, get rid of some of these woke policies. That's the interesting part, right? The Attorney General doesn't really prosecute crime, not in the way that we think of. That's handled by local prosecutors, local DAs, local law enforcement investigating these crimes. But what he says is that there's been a culture that's been allowed to erode that has sort of allowed some of these things to happen. And he thinks as a leader of law enforcement, he can change that culture. What Jeff Jackson is running on is a lot what Josh Stein, did when he was Attorney General. He thinks that the job is to protect the state citizens. So whether that's scams or certainly crime and safety, but scams, fentanyl, artificial intelligence leading to more fraud or more scams. He sort of sees it more holistically, I think would probably be a fair way to describe it. And, so they've laid out these different visions for what the job will do. I think it would be fair to say that Jackson would be sort of a continuation of the Stein-Cooper model of Attorney General, whereas I think Dan Bishop would be a much more crime and punishment type of Attorney General.
Well, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll hear about the evolution of the Attorney General seat and where it could lead politically. Stick around. Welcome back to the WRAL Daily Download. We're talking with WRAL reporter Brian Murphy about the race for North Carolina Attorney General. Brian, why would members of Congress want to leave that perch and go back to a state-level position? Is this a step backwards?
Well, I mean, in Jeff Jackson's case, there is no congressional district for him to return to. The districts were redrawn by the state legislature, and many Democrats, not just Jeff Jackson, were drawn out of their seats. Kathy Manning is another one who doesn't have a seat to go back to. So Jeff Jackson's seat is likely to be held by Tim Moore, House Speaker Tim Moore. And so Jackson, he ran for Senate and eventually bowed out for Sherry Beasley. So he's been eyeing sort of a statewide office. For Dan Bishop, that he would be in a very safe seat. Mark Harris looks like he'll win that seat, another Republican. But I mean, I think he's been a litigator or he's been a lawyer for a long time. Congress, you're just one of 435 people. It can be a frustrating place. I covered Congress for a while. I know many lawmakers who just get frustrated with the pace of change or how the travel is very tough. There's just a lot of things that people don't love about it. Whereas as a governor, as an attorney general, you can have a much more direct say or direct impact on people's lives than you can as one of 435. So I wouldn't necessarily call it a step back.
Both of these candidates have gained some national attention and notoriety for their time in Congress. What are their legacies in the House?
Yeah, I don't know that either one of them has a particularly strong or lengthy legacy. I think Bishop, by joining the House Freedom Caucus, has voted against a lot of measures, including budget bills, because they didn't follow the what they call regular order, omnibuses or minibuses, where they just throw a whole bunch of spending bills together. He often votes against that. Maybe one of his biggest legacies, he voted against certification of the election. He also was part of the group that originally held out their support for Kevin McCarthy to be the Speaker of the House. He did not vote for the motion to vacate, which ended up kicking Kevin McCarthy out of that role. But he was one of those holdouts early in the Congress that refused to vote for McCarthy, that led to many, vote after vote after vote before he was eventually installed. Because Jackson was a member of the minority party, it may be these TikToks that he did from his, kitchen, where he kind of explains what's happening in Congress. Not something we often get, sort of these explanations about why things are happening or how they're happening up there.
Now, you report that the profile of state attorneys general has really risen in recent years. Why is that?
Well, for a number of reasons, but I mean, I think, because all politics is national now, state attorney generals have been banding together, right? Democrats to attack Trump administration policies that they disagreed with, trying to file lawsuits in friendly jurisdictions to get those stopped or overturned. And Democrats, Republicans have been doing the same thing with Biden era rules that they disagree with. And we've seen this has a tremendous impact on abortion, on immigration, on diversity inclusion policies. And I don't think this is going to end. I think we're going to continue to see this. And so whoever gets this job is going to be in a position, if it's Bishop and there's a Harris administration, or if it's Jackson and there's another Trump administration, to file lots of these lawsuits with Attorney General of their same political party. That's one reason I think it's been elevated. A second reason is, attorneys general, and this happened under Stein, it actually happened under Cooper, have decided they're not going to enforce or not going to defend some state laws that are passed. We saw this with an abortion bill that was passed in the state legislature, and Stein said parts of it are unconstitutional. And so in some ways it's a very autonomous job. You can kind of build your own brand in that job in a way. The governor in North Carolina is very weak. The lieutenant governor really doesn't do anything. And that's not a shot at Mark Robinson. That position just simply doesn't have any responsibilities. Attorney general, in many ways, it can be a higher profile job than even governor, because you get to file lawsuits. You get to be involved. You get to kind of make your own public persona.
Well, let's talk about the state's sitting attorney general. That's Josh Stein. What has he accomplished in this role, and how could things change under either candidate? And also, what happens to his ongoing cases?
Yeah, he's really targeted some of these, and I wouldn't say Trump administration things, but he's targeted big companies, right? He's gone after Juul, got a big settlement from from the vape company Juul. I think he's filed a lawsuit against Meta. He's joined lawsuits against the NCAA. He's defended Obamacare, defended abortion rights. I mean, he's really turned it. And I can't speak to the history of the attorney general role, but in recent years, he's turned it into a platform for trying to get the things done that he wants to get done. He's won many of those lawsuits as well. And so, he's in many ways built his political brand and now is running for governor based on that political brand. He's done a lot of stuff with scams and price gouging and, sort of consumer interests. I'll be interested to see if that continues, because that's an area where you can score a lot of easy points. We just had a massive hurricane in the western part of the state. Price gouging, fraud, scams are probably all going to come out of that. That's an easy way for the attorney general to make his mark and say, hey, I'm going after – nobody likes somebody who's price gouging on hurricane victims. It's an easy win. What I thought was interesting in talking to Jackson in particular – he talked about other areas where this could be sort of expanded. One area he talked about was childhood education. You don't think of childhood education as something the attorney general is going to get involved in, but he mentioned the illiteracy rate of juvenile offenders and said this can be directly tied to education. And so I do wonder, again, that's platform building, that's brand building. If it is an attorney general Jackson, if he's able to expand the role into some of those spots. And quite frankly, if it's an attorney general Bishop, how much can he get involved in crime and safety? Do we see him denying a lot of appeals from convicted felons or other convicted people? Or do we see him taking on cases where he's defending law enforcement against charges of abuse or over-aggressive policing? I mean, I think these are the ways that each candidate could shape the role to fit them.
Now, the AG race has been seen sort of as a stepping stone to higher office. Could this race be a harbinger of future races?
Yeah. The last 5 people who've held this job have all run for governor, some successfully, Roy Cooper, Mike Easley, some unsuccessfully, and then we'll see what happens with Josh Stein. I mean, I think in Jackson's case for sure, right? He's only 42 years old. If he were to win this race, presuming that Josh Stein wins, Josh Stein's going to run for re-election. That's at least 8 years from now. On the Republican side, there's not a super deep bench of people to run statewide. We've seen Mark Robinson running, and if he were to lose, I don't know where Mark Robinson goes. If Hal Weatherman were to win the lieutenant governor's race, that would be an obvious stepping stone position for governor. But a tough on crime attorney general who can build his own portfolio as Attorney General Bishop would be able to do would be an interesting gubernatorial candidate. Now, Bishop would obviously carry a lot of baggage from HB2 and things like that, but time as the attorney general would give him time to refine that image and come up with a different platform to run on, particularly if crime were to drop dramatically.
So I see you brought your crystal ball. What does it tell you about the possible outcome of this race?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be close. Like, I don't think we need a crystal ball to tell that. There's been a lot of concern over what Mark Robinson's status in that race is going to do for races down the ballot. Jeff Jackson is quick to say, hey, what Robinson's implosion has meant is that money that may have gone to Robinson is now going to Bishop to try to win this race. When I talked to Bishop about it, he said, look, there's a lot of people who want to vote for Donald Trump. But you can't just put Donald Trump in office and then not fill the rest of the platform or the rest of the ballot out, right? He'll be awfully lonely in the White House if he doesn't have common sense conservatives with him to implement some of his policies. So that's the pitch that Bishop's making to voters. Hey, if you want Donald Trump to be successful, if he's elected president, then you need to elect people like me to help him along the way. Jackson's pitch, I think, is more tied into, we don't need an extremist as our next attorney general. We need someone who's going to be like Roy Cooper, going to be like Josh Stein. So he's in some ways talking about a continuation of what's happened, although he's expressed interest in new issues, fentanyl, artificial intelligence, childhood, literacy rates. So they're both making that closing pitch. The polling that we've seen is very close. There's a lot of money pouring in. I think it may be election day before we really have a good sense of what's going to happen here.
Where does the loser go?
It's a good question. I think Dan Bishop, we haven't even mentioned this, but Dan Bishop filed a defamation case against the Jeff Jackson campaign earlier this month. In that lawsuit, he said that he would just return to private practice. If he were to lose this race, he could see himself. He's a partner in a law firm in the Charlotte area. Could see himself returning to private practice. Jeff Jackson, is younger. Certainly has more of a political career probably ahead of him, but there's not a ton of space to go. And if Josh Stein were to win the governorship, there's a Senate race coming up, but will Democrats choose someone who just lost a statewide race? He's young. He has a young family. He has 3 children. I could see him getting into some kind of lawyer job that pays well and provides a foundation for his family. So that he's been a member of the military. He's a major in the Army National Guard. I think he probably has more options for what to do next. I mean, of course, both of them could look to Washington and see what happens with the presidency, and perhaps there's a job in the administration somewhere for the loser of this.
Going to be an interesting race to watch on election night. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you.
That's WRAL reporter Brian Murphy. For his preview of the North Carolina Attorney General race, go to the NC Capital section of WRAL.com. I'm Jack Hagel. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for listening to the WRAL Daily Download and for making us part of your morning routine. Another great way to get WRAL news is the Morning Briefing newsletter. It's a daily email with Triangle news, events, and headlines to help you get ready for the day. Sign up at WRAL.com/newsletter.